Well, it's the concept that muscle is the largest organ in the body. It's actually not just for locomotion. It's an endocrine organ. It determines everything about the way that we age. And it's the most underappreciated organ. So there's a cardiologist that deals with the heart. There are individuals, endocrinologists that deal with the thyroid, but muscle as an endocrine organ, when it contracts, it releases things like called myokines.
Wow.
And myokines travel throughout the body that protect the bone and the brain. The other aspect is that it's our metabolic currency. So it determines everything about our body composition. Why that's so important is for diseases of aging, like Alzheimer's, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, diabetes. It all starts in the muscle first. She was in her late 40s and she had 3 kids. She had been obese her entire life and been chasing this body fat issue. This, I have to lose body fat, I have to lose weight. We imaged her brain and I saw flattening of her brain matter. And we knew within 20 years, she was going to have some serious cognitive impairment, Alzheimer's. You know, whether it was Alzheimer's or cognitive impairment, but I realized at that moment that everyone is focusing on the wrong tissue, that we are looking at the pathological problem. You know, we're looking at pathology. We're looking at adipose tissue. Most people regain the weight, but the reality is the solution is muscle. And muscle is the most underappreciated organ. And by shifting the paradigm from the failure of the fat-focused paradigm to a muscle-centric approach, we can change the trajectory of aging. Insulin resistance is a problem everybody talks about. That is a primary deficit in the skeletal muscle first. Insulin resistance starts in the skeletal muscle because skeletal muscle is the primary site for glucose disposal. However, everybody is talking about fat tissue. That comes later. Muscle tissue is like a suitcase. If you overfill it, things spill back into the bloodstream. Then you store it as fat, not first. So by optimizing muscle tissue through resistance exercise, through really understanding the importance of dietary protein, high quality dietary protein, you can take care of this tissue that declines with aging, that becomes more insulin resistant, that becomes more anabolically resistant. By understanding that this is the mechanism of health, you can protect your family members. It's not about the amount of weight that you lose, it's about the quality. Every time you lose weight, for the most part, you lose partially muscle tissue and partially fat tissue. But if you do it strategically, the majority of the weight can just be fat. But it really takes some time and effort. And that is so valuable when we think about the recidivism, the regain weight. Myokines are, they're actually cytokines, so they're proteins that are particularly secreted by the muscle tissue when it contracts. For example, the most famous myokine is interleukin-6. And people are going to say, but interleukin-6, that's part of the cytokine system, that's part of the immune system. Well, yes, but muscle, when you contract muscle tissue, the myokine, for example, interleukin-6, is anti-inflammatory. So your skeletal muscle system actually works in conjunction with your immune system. And it has a counter-regulatory effect. Also, interleukin-6 allows for nutrient partitioning. So you'll utilize more fat tissue. You'll utilize more fatty acids. You'll utilize more glucose. So, you know, oftentimes when we think about exercise, we just think about that contractile health or the mitochondrial health. But when you really shift your focus to think about muscle as an endocrine organ and what it secretes, it totally changes the importance and the perspective. Brain-derived neurotropic factor, and it helps with memory. And we know the studies are really clear that the more you exercise, the better your memory, the better your cognition. The concept of anabolic resistance is there's a decrease in nutrient sensing in the body, in particular the muscle. So individuals require more dietary protein at one time to overcome this anabolic resistance, which is essentially an inefficiency of utilizing protein. And that's oftentimes why we see individuals who eat the way that they did when they were 20, continue to eat the same kind of macronutrients, get skinny fat because they never adapt and adopt to their changing hormonal milieu, which is testosterone decreases, IGF-1 decreases, which we're going to talk about. All these hormones decrease. And if you don't overcompensate for dietary protein, then your muscles don't even stand a chance. We know that if you have a robust amount of protein, and really when I say robust, that's between 30 and 50 grams per meal, you can overcome that anabolic resistance. And in particular, it's the high quality protein because it has the most abundant amino acids. The high quality protein has higher amounts of the branch chains, in particular leucine. And leucine is what triggers muscle protein synthesis. And interestingly, it triggers it through mTOR, which is mechanistic target of rapamycin. 30 grams of protein in a chicken breast is about 4 ounces. That's a little. To equate that to, say, a plant-based protein, it would be about 6 cups of quinoa.
6 cups of quinoa.
Yeah.
To get to get the amino acid equivalent of 4 ounces of chicken breast.
So that is metabolically devastating. You know, if we talk about carbohydrates, we can really talk about what that means and the best amount of carbohydrates. But really, when you think about carbohydrates, it has to be dosed in a meal threshold, right? Because you want to maintain insulin levels. You don't want to have a very robust insulin response, but you have to protect your tissue. So the difference between animal-based proteins and, you know, quality versus plant is you have to consume maybe 35% more. And it has so many more carbohydrates.
Yeah.
So it's just not doable. So this becomes very dangerous with this current narrative. Everybody's talking about going more plant-based. But the data, the NHANES data, which is the largest data set, would suggest we're already plant-based. But as it relates to protein, we can't confuse a plant-based diet with a high-quality protein diet. You just cannot. When you think about protein quality, you think about the DIAS. So these are digestibility amino acid scores. And these are hard, fast biological numbers. And it's really based on the quality of the amino acids and the digestibility of the amino acids. And, you know, when you really, a good practical way to think about that is animal-based proteins, including eggs or whey, those kinds of things, have a higher amino acid score. They are higher in the bioavailability. Whereas plant, you know, and there's some researchers out there that would say soy and wheat are just the same. You can look at a steak, you know that steak is not the same quality as a broccoli. The quality of muscle tissue, skeletal muscle tissue that we eat is very similar to our own tissue. And it provides the correct amino acid profile, in particular those branch chains, those leucine, isoleucine, and valine that we need in the correct amounts. And that's where it becomes so important to understand that it's not just eat high quality protein. It's eat the correct amount of protein in a 24-hour period, which is arguably well above double the RDA. So the RDA is 0.8 grams per kilogram. 1.6 grams per kilogram is probably still on the lower end.
Wow.
In my clinical practice, I recommend 1 gram per pound ideal body weight. Because protein isn't just about muscle. It also helps with appetite regulation. And we know body composition is the ultimate. But we don't really eat for protein, we eat for those amino acids. And there's 20 different amino acids and they do all kinds of different things. And that's what we need. So you have to understand that it's a 24-hour period. And then you have to break it down to bolus feeding meals. And that's so important, especially as we're aging and especially when we think about sarcopenia, which is the loss of muscle mass and function, and when we think about anabolic resistance. Because you still require that amino acid bolus to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. So you can stimulate it 2 ways, really, arguably. You can stimulate it through dietary protein and resistance exercise.
So you can literally change your body composition just purely by eating more protein.
You can. You do have to control for calories, but you absolutely can, and I've seen it happen.
Wow.
Arguably, resistance exercise is even more important than diet when it comes to the literature, which I actually didn't want to believe. But it really is important to, you know, challenge the muscle and stimulate it. You know, you can't get away from that.
Right.
So a lot of the information, the studies that have come out are epidemiological studies. So they're not randomized controlled trials. They're what we would consider low quality data. And when you think about epidemiological studies, you think about relative risk or risk ratio. And in order for something to be clinically significant, it has to be above 2. Let me give you an example. Smoking and cancer. It has a relative risk of 12. They looked at all the study and all the literature of cancer and protein. Guess what the relative risk was?
Probably a fraction.
1.1.
Wow.
So in order for it to be clinically significant, the relative risk has to be above 2.
Got it.
1.1 is clinically insignificant.
Got it. So it's like basically meaningless.
Correct. So everyone will say meat is a carcinogen. The Annals of Internal Medicine, first of all, reviewed all of this. Annals of Internal Medicine is like the Super Bowl of literature. I mean, it's one of the most highly respected journals.
Huge impact factor.
Exactly. They found no increased risk. The committee that actually talked about protein and cancer risk turned out to be largely vegetarian. And they had a very strict criteria where they threw out all the high quality data. They limited a large amount of the randomized controlled trials and used low quality epidemiological data. It seems to me that there is a massive agenda problem. If IGF-1 was really a problem, then everyone in their 30s, when IGF-1 is their highest, arguably, or maybe late 20s, would have cancer. But you never see that. It just doesn't make sense. It doesn't add up. Let's take a step back. So mTOR is mechanistic target of rapamycin. And people say that it's one of the pathways for growth promotion, which it is. Did you know that there's mTOR in every single tissue? And what if I told you it's sensitive to different macronutrients as well? Skeletal muscle is exquisitely sensitive to dietary protein. mTOR is also stimulated by other things, like excess calories and excess insulin, which the liver and the pancreas are much more sensitive to. So if you're really concerned about mTOR and cancer, the worst thing that you could do is eat a high carbohydrate diet with excess calories. Arguably has nothing to do with protein and amino acids. That's like saying exercise is bad for you. The more trained you are, you know how hard it is to put on skeletal muscle?
It's hard.
It is impossible. Have you ever met a girl say, I just am not going to, I'm afraid I'm going to get bulky. I'm going to really train hard, but I'm afraid I'm going to get bulky. In the history of never, I've never seen that. I've seen thousands of patients. No one has ever said, well, I'm getting too bulky.
I think you have like these fit influencers on Instagram now that, many females who probably are taking other kinds of substances. Right. And so, but that's not how your average female is going to look once they start resistance training.
No, you're going to look better. You're going to have tighter skin. You're going to likely be smaller. You're going to have better body composition. You're going to improve your inflammatory markers. You're going to improve your glucose control because you have more skeletal muscle. Muscle is your metabolic currency. It is the largest site for glucose disposal. When you think about your resting metabolic rate, muscle is it. Muscle is incredibly underappreciated. And especially as you transition to perimenopause, menopause, the more muscle you can put on in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, the better you're going to be because it becomes more difficult. The higher the protein intake, the better the bone density.
Wow.
Because bone is made of protein. There's multiple meta-analysis, so a group of really high-quality papers that have come out. It actually improves kidney function. It improves glomerular filtration rate.
Are these in people with healthy kidneys?
Yeah. If you are healthy, they've never seen an individual consume too much protein. Everybody thinks that the more protein you eat, it's bad for your bones. That is totally false. And again, we looked at some of this at WashU, that the higher the protein intake with resistance training, the better the bone density. The resistance training piece is really missed. People talk a lot about yoga, talk a lot about Pilates, and then it's really important to do resistance training, and it doesn't have to be heavy. And I cringe when I say that, but the data supports that as long as you have enough volume going to failure. I do recommend calcium in my practice. I recommend calcium, vitamin D, K2. And also in certain amounts, you can't just take a whole bolus of calcium all at once. That's not what is recommended.
And I'm using air quotes, balanced meal look like for you?
So I don't know if I believe in the balance, and I'm just being truthful. I think that the number one thing that you have to do is you have to determine your ideal body weight. Mm-hmm. I'm 125 pounds. I'll keep that as an ideal body weight. I'll have 125 grams of protein. How you build a baseline nutrition plan. Mm-hmm. After that, I think about, do you like carbohydrates or do you like fat? I personally don't eat many carbohydrates. And if you think about it, for every 100 grams of protein you eat, you generate 60 grams of carbohydrates.
Wow.
So an individual could do a largely, protein-based diet and generate all the glucose they need through gluconeogenesis. It's okay if I overshoot protein because protein is very difficult to store as fat. There's never been any negative studies. I mean, they've gone up to 3.3 grams per kilogram easily.
Wow.
And we've never seen any detrimental effects. Improves satiation. It improves body turnover, right? So we're replacing 300 grams a day. Everyone focus on gut health. One of the amino acids, threonine, is so important for mucin production, for gut health. Our immune cells utilize these amino acids for health. You know, it's so under-discussed and so important. Breakfast is eggs. We have a little infant, so it's whatever is easy. Maybe 5 eggs, whole eggs.
You're not also thinking like, got to get my fiber. Like, what do you?
No, I don't actually.
You don't?
And I'm not sure what I think about this whole fiber situation. I think it really depends on the gut microbiome. But I can tell you from my clinical experience in NF1, which is not quite important, that I don't need it. And I have a ton of patients that do well without it.